I'm Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the program. Our guest today has been nominated for the Andrew Carnegie Medal and also for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. His writing often appears in Esquire, The New Yorker, and Time. He is a former Marine and intelligence officer who served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan and received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. Today, we will be discussing Elliot's new book, Red Dress in Black and White, a story of an American woman attempting to leave behind her life in Turkey without her husband. Before we begin, I'd like to highlight some of our World Affairs speakers that we have coming up for you. Our upcoming guests include featuring the Dean of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. We're also going to be having an excellent conversation on Hong Kong and its global importance, and a dialogue on refugees in America. Our special guest in August will be Bob Reich, the former Secretary of Labor who has served in the administrations of Presidents Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton. And don't miss all of our recent conversations we've had with our 2020 Jesse H. Jones Global Leaders of Influence. They're available now on this YouTube channel. And don't miss our live celebration with the Council's 2020 International Citizen of the Year, Noble Energy's Chairman and CEO, Dave Stover. You'll find it right here, available on August 13th on this YouTube channel. So be sure to click the button and stay engaged and be connected with us. Now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome back to the program World Affairs Council of Greater Houston's guest speaker for today, Elliot Ackerman. Elliot, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Marianne.
We're pleased that you could join us, and you were just saying you and your family are doing well?
Yeah, we are. We have adjusted to our new coronavirus normal, but everyone is healthy and doing well. So thank you for asking.
Well, thank you. Today we have an amazing book that you've written. I have it here, Red Dress in Black and White. And it follows another amazing novel that you did, Waiting for Eden. And this unfolds a story of an American woman attempting to leave behind her life in Turkey. Tell us kind of a little bit where you found this topic and what was most interesting to you and why you chose this to explain a story. I'm sure that your preview is going to be a little bit better than mine might be.
Sure, I don't know about that. You know, in all of my work, Marianne, I also work contemporaneously as a journalist, and I write lots of nonfiction as well. And in my fiction, I'm always very interested in the ways political events echo through people's personal lives. I think we're all actually living that right now with coronavirus, one that's touched every person on this globe. So I lived in Turkey for about 3 years, and I moved there right after the Gezi Park protest, which occurred in 2013, May 2013. And for anyone who's not necessarily familiar with that series of protests, it was really the most significant challenge to the Turkish state in at least a generation. And so when I moved to Istanbul, I could see very much how those protests were echoing out amongst the lives of many of my Turkish friends, and how there was this sort of real upending of the conventions of Turkish society. So the story, Red Dress in Black and White, it takes place over a single day where there's this American woman, Catherine, and she is fleeing her Turkish husband, a man named Murat, who is a real estate developer. And if you know anything about the Gezi Park protests, it originally had to do with real estate. The protests were about the development of a shopping mall on a small plot of land, which was Gezi Park in the center of Turkey. And so she's fleeing her real estate developer husband over the course of this one day with her lover, who is an American photographer. And the book toggles between that one day and the past, really 7 years, but sort of the lead up to Gezi Park, and then we see what happens at Gezi Park. And as that one day is unfolding, we start to understand how these events leading up to Gezi Park and during Gezi Park very much inform her ability to leave Istanbul and the city. So ultimately, it's the story of societal upheaval told through the prism of a very personal upheaval, which is the upheaval in this marriage.
How do you you've woven an amazing, intriguing story that really has a really interesting ending, so I don't want to give that away. But was this story birthed from any awareness of a real life experience, or an awareness of a situation, or was it totally just bred from your imagination?
I think, obviously, like all storytelling, you're trying to get at truth. And so there are many things in the story I could point to and say, this comes from something that happened to me or something that I witnessed. There are very extensive scenes written about the Gezi Park protests, describing those protests. And a lot of that is drawn from experiences I had covering subsequent protests as a journalist. But ultimately, it is a work of imagination. And that's one of the reasons I like writing fiction, is because all the rules that I have to apply to my journalism, I can throw out the door, and I can sit down at my desk each day and be surprised at the direction these characters will take me. And often it's only after the fact that I really start to understand how my own experiences and things that I have seen kind of pop up in unexpected ways in the story. And they certainly do in Red Dress and Black and White.
And lots of geopolitical references throughout and parallels. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that is easier for me in writing a book like Red Dress and Black and White, which all takes place in Istanbul and is very much engaged with Turkish politics in many respects, is the one constant through all of this are people, human beings. And yes, we have our cultural differences, but my experience has always told me our cultural differences are normally somewhat superficial. And when you really probe deeper than the surface, you realize that we are all a lot the same. So, there are many kind of parallels, I think, with what's been going on in Turkish politics, what's been going on in American politics, and both Turkish and American societies. So it allows me some distance to write about those themes by writing about them in Turkey, as opposed to trying to write about those themes in the United States, which sort of seems just impossible at this moment. And one of, I think, the central themes in the story is, it's one part love story. It's one part, political thriller and almost a mystery, is that we start to see how in a moment of crisis, in the story I'm referring to is when Catherine leaves her husband and tries to upend their lives and return back to the United States, that suddenly in that moment of crisis, all of the invisible structures and power dynamics that have underpinned her life and her husband Murat's life, and Peter the photographer's life, and a character named Karen who works at the American consulate's life, you start to see the hidden power structures between all of them, and really the foundations of a life laid bare. And it's a crisis that does that. And so obviously I wrote this book long before the events we're all living through. But I think one thing, these events show, which is obviously a crisis we've really been in since March, is how it's sort of a moment of upheaval and shows us sometimes in very stark ways the invisible architecture, not only of our own lives, but of our society.
So lots of analogies, lots of parallels. Tell us a little bit about the title, Red Dress in Black and White. And there's a significance of the photo of a woman in a red dress at Gezi Park. Maybe you could explain a little bit about that and how you've woven it through the storyline.
Well, I think, the the Gezi Park protests, again, were in Turkish society, you know, as significant as, for instance, like the Black Lives Matter protests that we're seeing right now. And often in protest movements like that, there are iconic images that come out of them. And so the really iconic image that came out of the Gezi Park protests was this photograph that just became known as the photograph of the woman in the red dress. And it was a young woman who was basically walking into work. And I think what was really striking about those protests was that that after a while, just sort of everyday people began participating. So she was an everyday person walking into work. She was wearing a red dress, and over her shoulder, she had a white tote bag. And obviously, there's symbology there, red and white being the national colors of Turkey. And a police officer is stepping towards her in this photograph with a can of pepper spray, and he's pepper spraying right in her face. This sort of, you know, kind of yellow, toxic-looking cloud of pepper spray. And the cloud is sweeping her black hair back kind of over her face, so you can't necessarily see her, and she's obscured. And that really became the image of resistance in Turkey. So what the novel presupposes is you have this character, Peter, who is also an American living in the city, and he is trying to make the transition from being a photojournalist to being a fine arts photographer. And he is very interested in how he sees the city and sees the juxtaposition of political trends in the city, which if you've ever been to Istanbul, it's a city, it's a very pluralistic city. It's a city of so many contradictions. You know, it's at one time a very religious city, at one time a very cosmopolitan city. So he's very interested in those contrasts in his own photography. And Peter actually photographs the woman in the red dress on the same day that the iconic photograph is taken. However, hapless Peter takes that photo in black and white, and it's resigned to obscurity because it didn't capture the color, you know, which is the red, which is what you really needed. So the title is very much, I think, a reference not only to that one photo, but often to how we see certain events, whether in color or in black and white.
It's an amazing book. I've really enjoyed reading it. Thank you for the experience that I went through. I wasn't expecting the end, so make sure you all read it and get to the end because it's very intriguing. Elliot, I have to ask you, you've been an accomplished infantry special operations officer. You've worked in presidential elections. You've been affiliated with political organizations. Tell us how you evolved from a military officer to the political realm, a little bit about how you got into writing.
Oh, sure. Well, my mother is a writer, so I always grew up around writers, and it didn't seem like the strangest thing for one to do. And I studied history and literature at school, but decided when I was at university I wanted to go into the Marines. And my commissioning year, the year I went on active duty, was 2003, which was obviously an auspicious year to be a newly minted Marine Corps infantry officer. And so my first deployment was to Iraq, and I was there in 2004 during the Fallujah battle. I wound up staying in the military for about 8 years in military and intelligence. But it's funny, Marianne, people who've known me the longest will say to me, we think isn't it funny that you wound up in the Marines, as opposed to saying, isn't it funny that you wound up on the back end as a writer? Just because as a kid, I was always sort of had those, like I had kind of artistic sensibilities, loved movies, loved reading. But then I also did have this military interest and wanted to serve. So I think, and, I have kids myself now who are, getting older before my own eyes. And I think, all of us, we contain multitudes and many, many interests. At different times of our life, we engage more intensely with different sides of our personality. So when I was in the Marines, I was reading, but I wasn't writing that intensely. I was very much, frankly, focused on being a Marine and doing my job and the mission I had and the people I was deployed with and the team that I was on. And I had to suppress certain parts of my personality and interests to do that. Now I've left the Marines, and, most of my day, I'm either out reporting, if it's not coronavirus, or I'm sitting on my own in front of a computer screen doing my work. And that engages with other facets of my personality. But the part of me that was the Marine that was on the team, I don't get to engage with that. So Walt Whitman said we all contain multitudes, and I think that that's very true. But I love the work that I'm doing now.
That's great. I know we're going to get to some of these questions. One quick question is, are you going to translate the book into Turkish or have it translated?
It's so funny you asked me that. I was literally, as we were getting ready to do this, was emailing with my Turkish publisher about something else. It was great. So the next book I have coming out in Turkey is actually not this one, but I hope that it will. I anticipate it will get translated into Turkish, and very much look forward to that. My first book that I wrote, a novel called Green on Blue, was all set in Afghanistan, and it was told from the perspective of a young Afghan soldier. And one of the things that's been very gratifying for me, is hearing from Afghan readers who've read that book. And talking about the war. So I look forward to this book coming out and, finding more Turkish readers as well.
You, since leaving the military, you've done some different things. What would you say is the political environment? What would be your purview of the political environment that exists today in Istanbul?
I think it's fascinating. So when I moved to Istanbul, I had started traveling to southern Turkey because I was working as a journalist covering the Syrian civil war. So I was based out of southern Turkey, like most journalists were, and going into Syria or going into Iraq as ISIS spread eastward. And but what wound up happening was, the situation in Turkey became as dynamic, if not more dynamic, than what was happening in the Syrian civil war in Iraq. And I think, for a number of years now, but particularly since 2013 in Gezi Park, there has been, a real erosion of civil liberties inside of Turkey and a consolidation of power. It was first Prime Minister Erdogan's power, and then, he has since created an executive presidency. And that's been a shift. Whereas before Gezi Park, there were lots of hopes that, for instance, that Turkey might join the EU, and it seemed that it was much more westward facing. And now there's been a distinctly eastward shift. And I think what you're sort of seeing in Turkey today is really kind of almost like a rise of a new Ottomanism, where I think one of the things that's interesting about Turkey is that the founding of the Republic after the First World War, is really a nation that's founded out of a defeat and is founded with a very limited mission and sense of itself. It was very conscious, Ataturk was very conscious of the fact that modern secular Turkey would be a direct repudiation of its Ottoman past and some of the excesses of that past, both what Ataturk perceived as the religious excesses, as well as the national security excesses for the country. So very much a country that was contained within its borders. And now, nearly 100 years later, many of those limits are being rejected. The focus on secularism is being rejected by very significant parts of Turkish society, as is the limited foreign policy. And we've seen that most acutely in Turkey's involvement in Syria. So I only bring that up because all of this was up in the air, particularly in the time that I was living there. And, and anyone watching could really see a profound sea change in just what it meant to be Turkish and Turkey's sense of itself and its re-engagement with its Ottoman past.
Has women's rights changed in the past few years?
I think certainly as Turkey has become more conservative, that has eroded women's rights inside of Turkey. And it's sort of remarkable how quickly, this has come about. I mean, really within 15 years from a time, not in the teens, but in the aughts, where there was a great deal of controversy about women who even wanted to wear the hijab and were prosecuted for wearing a hijab, to now women being prosecuted if they don't wear a hijab. So it's certainly a challenge to women's rights, and the education system in Turkey has become far less secular, and you've even seen for instance the Turkish government sponsoring programs to teach Turkish citizens how to read the old Arabic script Ottoman alphabet, because obviously Turkish society is cut off from its Ottoman past also by language, because the entire alphabet was revamped at the founding of the Turkish state by Ataturk. So there are all these trends happening, relatively quickly and particularly acutely after 2013.
Do you see Erdogan staying in power for the foreseeable future of the election? Would you have any thoughts on that?
I do see him staying in power. I think he has done a very good job of purging the state of his political opponents and re-engineering the Turkish constitution so it's favorable for him to hold on to power for an extended period of time. And I think the longer these autocrats stay in power, the more difficult it is to root them out. You do have the challenge of him obviously maintaining the relative strength of the Turkish economy. We've seen a massive devaluation of the lira in the past 5 years. And obviously, if at a certain point you have a completely non-viable economy, that would represent a threat to his power. But the fact of the matter is, too, as well, he has a very viable and very real base of support in Turkey, and and as I brought up before, it's understandable in so much as he's speaking to a portion of Turkish society that no longer wants to feel as though it has to only fulfill a certain prescribed role on the world stage, and that curtailed role is birthed out of the First World War. It starts to feel antiquated to some Turks, particularly when you can throw back and point to a Turkish past that was where Ottoman past, where the role Turkey played was far more central, in the Eastern world and the world at large. So I don't think Erdogan is going anywhere, nor do I think the type of neo-Ottoman vision he's offering is going to go away either.
What would you describe as I know Turkey has a position with other players in the Middle East, especially after Khashoggi's murder. What do you think Erdogan's support of the Muslim Brotherhood looks like, and just other political groups?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because obviously the Muslim world is certainly not a monolith, and I think it's a mistake for us as Westerners to ever view it as such, and to ever also underestimate how much of this is to just realpolitik, nation state versus nation state type dynamics. So I think the fact of the matter is, Erdogan views Turkey as the leader of the Muslim world. There are obviously many other countries, you mentioned Khashoggi, like the Saudis, who view themselves as the leader of the Muslim world. And so you have that, you definitely have those forms of competition. I think one of the places where they have those forms of competition have manifested has been in Syria, or even in places like Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think you'll continue to have that power struggle in the Muslim world for the foreseeable future.
One of our listeners writes, in your opinion, what is your opinion on the Hagia Sophia being turned into a mosque?
Yeah, one of the things that's fascinating to me about Turkey is there's so many parallels with the United States. And I think, obviously one would be mistaken in the United States for presuming that any major East Coast city or West Coast city is representative of the United States. And I think what often happens in Turkey is people feel that Istanbul is representative of Turkey, and it is not. I only bring that up because the history of Istanbul is not the history of Turkey, and the history of Istanbul is an incredibly pluralistic history and a pluralistic culture that exists there still. And so the Hagia Sophia has long been a symbol of that. And Istanbulites, I think, look at it that way as it being, in the past, having been a very inclusive symbol, and that Istanbul is this great melting pot. And I've always, in the novel, I get to say, the novel is very much sort of a paean to Istanbul because it's one of those great world cities. It's like a Paris or a Rome. I'd say, a London, in America, I think, New York City is one of our great cities, or Houston. But the point is, people are always going to live in Istanbul. From the time it was Byzantium to Constantinople to Istanbul, and Istanbul as a city will probably survive longer than Turkey survives as a country, just because of where it is geographically located. So I only bring that up because I think for many people, the Hagia Sophia represents that. And there are, you walking around Istanbul, whether it's, it's Constantine's column. I mean, there are all these symbols of the hippodrome that have nothing to do with Muslim society or Ottoman society that predated by 1,000 years, but there they are still. And it's very powerful to see that because they're just sort of like humanity's monuments. And I'm probably speaking more personally. So on a personal level, I'll say I always viewed the Hagia Sophia that way, as it's, like this is for all of us. And to see it turned into a mosque, obviously, is a repudiation of that. But clearly, it's very popular to a certain type of supporter of Erdogan, and he is going to go forward with it. But I think the countervailing view is that should be something that is not politicized and not turned into yet another mosque, and that in some ways it is diminished. But I, for one, take heart in knowing that these currents always swing back and forth. And if it's a mosque now, maybe who knows how long it will be a mosque for, but probably won't be a mosque forever. It'll be something else. And I, for one, hope that whatever that next iteration is, it's something that is, inclusive for everybody.
One of our students writes, do you see a war coming between Egypt and Turkey and any more conflicts with Libya?
I don't know if I feel like Turkey probably has its hands full with what it is doing in Syria. I don't think that means you're not going to see continued competition in North Africa with the Turks. But I think it's also, it's important to keep in mind their status as a NATO member nation. I think that complicates issues for the Turks. And I think what we've seen their incursions into Syria tie into this sort of neo-Ottoman vision, where if you look at so much of the war inside of Syria has been about Sykes-Picot, and if you look at the pre-Sykes-Picot war, Aleppo was an Ottoman city, and the Turks would love to see it become, if not a Turkish city, one that's very closely tied in within Turkish influence. And when I was working in southern Turkey, you're really given an appreciation for the geography. I worked in a city called Gaziantep. I spent a lot of time in Gaziantep, and when you drive the roads of Gaziantep, you see the highway exits. It's exit 32 to Aleppo, because before the Syrian civil war, it was about a 45-50-minute drive into Aleppo, and the borders were open, and there was a lot of commerce back and forth. So I think a lot of the more aggressive Turkish military moves, although they are aggressive, we've seen them prescribed to kind of feeling out those borders, not only geographic borders, but borders of influence. And I don't, for one, think that we'll see that bleed into open war with Egypt or Libya, but could always be wrong.
Somewhat related is your outlook on the Kurdish removal efforts.
I think that is very troubling. I mean, listen, obviously it follows a long trend of Turkish antipathy and repression of their Kurdish minority in the southeast. I think we as Americans, our policy towards the Kurds has not been somewhat myopic. It hasn't been looking off on vast horizons, and I think we clearly turned our back on the Kurds at a very important and crucial time for them after they had done so much to help our efforts, not only in Syria, but also in Iraq. Particularly, I covered the battle in Mosul, and the Kurds were instrumental in that victory. So for us to sort of hand them over to their worst adversary, the Turks, is sort of beyond the pale. And, sadly, if history teaches us anything, there are consequences to that down the road. And that ball kind of keeps bouncing. So I think that it was a very nearsighted move of us to just up and leave the Turks to the mercy of to leave the Kurds to the mercy of the Turks.
We have a question. How do you think Americans are perceived by the Turkish?
Good question. It's very difficult, obviously, to refer to the Turkish as a monolith. I think a certain brand of more conservative Turks have bought on to much of Erdogan's narrative about the Americans, which are, the Americans are the root of all evil. There are rife conspiracy theories that make their way into the news in Turkey about Americans. It's sort of funny. And you would think if these conspiracy theories were true, if these conspiracy theories were true, it would mean we as Americans are possessed with incredible competence that I wish we always had. We'd certainly be doing a lot better against this virus. But then there's, I've traveled around the world and people are people. And you set someone down and you talk to them for 5 minutes, we all start talking about our kids and we find common ground. And that for me has always been a great source of optimism. And so I've met people just like that in Turkey and particularly in Istanbul, and living there. All I ever felt was welcome. And when people found that I was American, all I wanted to do was talk about America and what was going on there. Like I think any place you find all stripes wherever you go.
We have another question from a viewer. The military used to keep a kind of more secular position, but that has seemed to change. How do the Turks feel about that?
Well, I think this goes to this, to this key issue in Turkey, which is the tension that exists between secularism and the fact that the country is, I believe, 97% Muslim. Analogy often used is if you look at the United States, right? And I think most societies have these. Most societies have sort of like a key tension that is baked into the fabric of that society. Like in the U.S., I would say it's sort of the tension that exists between the federal government or federalism and sort of the rights of states. In fact, and again, we're seeing it play out in the coronavirus response. What's the responsibility of the federal government? How are they supposed to respond, and what's on the plate for them? And, what are local leaders supposed to do at the state level? And we've always seen that throughout our history. There are issues with that in our own civil war. If you look at Turkey, I would say the similar kind of tension baked into Turkish society is this one between their Muslim identity and the fact that it is a secular country. And you see that playing out in the military right now. And it's like a pendulum, and swings one way or the other. I think under Erdogan now, we've clearly seen it swing more towards the side of religiosity and religion being something that's very fundamental to the society in a way that, it wasn't 20 years ago and really wasn't under Ataturk's founding. Will that swing the other way? I think it probably would. But post-coup, that really allowed Erdogan to cement his grip around the military in a way that he hadn't been able to do before the coup.
And swinging back to journalism, what about freedom of speech and the hundreds of journalists that are imprisoned in Turkey?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Turkey is not a place where it is good to be a journalist, and it is not a place where you have freedom of speech, and you have, very, very few media outlets that are able to be critical of the government. And it's been really, really sad to see what has happened to free speech in Turkey in an incredibly short amount of time. It's dizzying. Turkish friends of mine who are writers, and are still speaking out, are incredibly brave people.
Mm-hmm. You spoke very briefly about your next project. What will that look like, and will it have a Turkish flavor?
It won't. The next book that I have out is actually finished. As you know, it takes a while to produce books, so the writing is done. We're just in the production process now, proofreading and things like that. But the book is it's actually the first book I'm co-writing with someone, and my writing partner is Admiral Jim Stavridis, you might know him. He is the retired 4-star Supreme Allied Commander, so head of NATO. And he and I have co-written a book. The title is 2034, A Novel of the Next World War. And it's a speculative work of fiction of what it would look like if the US and China went to war in the year 2034, primarily at sea. So that will be out in March of 2021.
He's an amazing individual as well. I have to ask, how did you find working with him? I mean,
it was great. Yeah, it was great. And we're old friends. He was the dean of the Fletcher School. I'm an alum, so I got to know him as an alumnus of the Fletcher School. And I was actually the writer in residence at the Fletcher School for a semester. So we got to know each other well there. He's an incredibly, just in fiction, well-read guy. I mean, he reads everything that comes out, and it was just a blast working together on this project. And we actually have the same editor at Penguin Press, and that was sort of how we cooked up this idea. So it'll be out in March, and it's a book. It's told on a very big stage, lots of characters, American characters, Chinese characters, Iranian characters, and it moves quickly. So I'm looking forward to having it out in the world and talking about it.
Maybe in the spring, possibly.
Absolutely, we'd love to come.
Oh, that would be great. Elliot, any closing remarks about your book, your career, your experience, Houston, COVID? Love to hear any closing things.
So I think that I'm just thrilled to be talking to everyone here tonight. Check out the book. I hope you will. And I think stories are what connect us. It's how I understand the world. Not only the political contours of the world, but the emotional contours of the world. And I believe the two are inextricably linked. So it's why I work as a journalist, and it's why I write fiction. But thank you all so much for having me with you tonight.
Well, Elliot, it's been our pleasure, and not only for our book club members, but our regular members, all of our council cabinets. Make sure you pick up a copy. It was a real thriller, a page turner. You'll enjoy reading it. Elliot, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or evening for you. Wishing you and your family well, and we look forward to having you back in the spring.
I'll look forward to it. Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you all. We'll see you next time. Good evening. Stay safe.